Thanks very much, Shannon, and good morning, everyone. I hope you have a coffee and a croissant at hand, which is something you can do that we couldn't do if we were in a lecture theatre, so there are some advantages. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, particularly the Agra and Turrbal peoples of the country where the exhibition is held, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay respects to the Abalich, Winkenham, Wanam, Chara and Putsch clans of the Wik and Wikwe people of Arakoon, which is where Mavis Ngallametta was born and lived. Thank you to qagoma and to Shannon Johnson for inviting me today, and thank you all for attending. I'd also like to acknowledge the University of Queensland and supporting the research that we do in the arts and humanities, particularly in a time when, you know, those government support for those kinds of contributions that we make to community well-being, if you like, are getting tighter and tighter. So thank you to everyone. So I'd just like to begin by situating the discussion a little. Situating the discussion in the context of this particular exhibition that's currently on at qagoma, in the context of the artist, very briefly in the context of myself, and also very briefly in the context of yourselves. The exhibition, some of you may have had a chance to visit the exhibition, or, you know, there's still time to get in there. But if not, there's some excellent videos of exhibition walkthroughs by Katina Davidson, who's the curator of Indigenous art at qagoma and also the co-curator of this exhibition. So I strongly recommend that you jump on and have a look at those if you haven't actually seen the exhibition. The exhibition surveys the work of Mavis Ngallametta and includes paintings from 2008 until 2019, when she unfortunately passed away. It also includes some sculptures and weavings by the artist. It was curated by Bruce McLean, who's the Assistant Director of Indigenous Engagement at the National Gallery of Australia, and was formerly the Curator of Indigenous Art before Katina here at qagoma. So in my talk today, I'll be focusing on these works in particular, which are the later works and the larger canvases created by Mavis Ngallametta, and what I'll call her signature style. But I'll also briefly be looking at how that signature style relates to different perspectives that Mavis Ngallametta brought in her art. So the screen here is a display in that exhibition showing you some of the different styles that Mavis Ngallametta was, you know, experimenting with and working through as she developed what I later call this signature style. Now, this is just giving you, situating the artist a little bit in terms of her country and culture. If you can see here, this image here is showing Arakoon, and from an aerial map, and there it is over there on the west coast of Cape York Peninsula. The area is a very significant area, wild river system, wetlands, all kinds of, you know, natural heritage, etc. So it's a very fluid environment in terms of the ebb and flow of salt water and fresh water, and in terms of the wet and dry seasons. Now, this is the coastline near Arakoon, and it's a very significant coastline, not only to Mavis Ngallametta's art, but also to the Wikankuga cultures of the region. It's called Ecology, and basically what you're looking at are these stripes of red and white ochres, and down here you can see Mavis Ngallametta collecting some of these ochres. And there's another image of it here. And if you like, this is part of what the people of this land have described as the signature style or the signature characteristic of country. And that's why they use it as a major aesthetic in their art. So these beautiful law poles here show this red and white ochre. So the red and white ochres are country itself, but they're also highly symbolic of that culture. Now, basically what I'm going to be talking about with this idea of emotional ecology in this talk is that Mavis Ngallametta's signature style synthesizes all of this aspect of human and natural activity and this sort of human and natural ecology, if you like. It's all brought together in her artwork. So just keep that in mind for a sec. And this is one of these later paintings. So you can see there it's called Flying to Kendall, number 2, 2013. So Kendall River is a particular part of Mavis Ngallametta's homelands. So all of that human and natural activity that combines country and culture to Mavis Ngallametta, I'm going to argue is aesthetically characterised as a potent fluidity that underpins an emotional ecology. So this here, I think, epitomises what I'm talking about. The impact of her art is synthesises all that she knows and loves about how her people relate to her place and how she brings it all together and expresses that and condenses it into something that translates as an aesthetic, as a potent fluidity. And I'm arguing that potent fluidity is an emotional ecology. It's an expression of an emotional ecology. So just in terms of situating myself, I'm a non-Indigenous art historian, so I do not bring an Indigenous perspective to this art. I have worked with the artists from Aurukun in curating an exhibition some time ago called Before Time Today, which looked at the relationship between contemporary and historical art from Aurukun. I was very privileged to work with that. I was very privileged to visit the community a few times, and I've worked with Mavis Ngallametta on a few projects. But that gives me a very surface knowledge. You know, I do not bring an Indigenous perspective to this art. What I'm trained in terms of looking at art and talking about art are all kinds of art historical methods, one of which, of course, is iconography, which is, you know, simply looking at visual codes and symbols, understanding what they represent and putting them together to sort of understand how they tell a visual story. Now, sometimes in Indigenous art, there are visual codes and symbols, and certainly Central Desert art and, you know, many other regions around Australia use or translate, if you like, traditional codes and symbols into contemporary idiom. And on the left of the screen here, you can see an artwork by another North Queensland artist, Roy McIver, who's actually from the east coast of Cape York, qagoma people. And you can see there, you can actually identify symbols and codes. They're all, what he does with them is very kind of contemporary idiom of bringing them all together. Some of them are sort of almost a universal code, if you like. Some of them relate particularly to Quincan country rock art and to body art from his culture, etc. But there is a sort of, you know, a symbology there that you could start to work with, if you like. Certainly from a non-Indigenous perspective, the codification is very complex in the way that it's used within an Indigenous culture, but there's certainly something there to work with in terms of being a non-Indigenous spectator. But the thing with Mavis Ngallametta's art, which is on the right, is that she is not using any traditional codes and symbols, or very few, if you like. She's using that red and white ochre aesthetic on acrylic blue background in a lot of the later works, but there's no traditional iconography or symbolism that you can really kind of link to sort of, you know, try to understand what's going on in the artwork. And so what I'm sort of saying is, well, what do you do? What do you do as a non-Indigenous spectator if you want to talk about this art? Where do you start? And with that, Shannon, we'll flip to the poll. So this is where I want to situate yourselves a little. Now, all this is two very quick, short polls, and there's no right or wrong answer. In a way, all it's doing is designed is to just see who's in the virtual room today and get a bit of a sense of the mindset of how we're thinking about this art, or how we feel about talking about this art, or how we feel about the art. Just so that we have a sense of that. So the first one here, and all you do is quickly one answer and poll, and then we'll move on to the next one after a minute or two. So the first one is, if prompted to talk about this painting, what best describes your response? Okay, I think the numbers are still moving around a little bit. If you can just do your response in the next 30 seconds, and then we'll close it and then have a very quick look at the results. Okay, Shannon, that might be due for that one, thanks. So a lot of people like talking about any kind of art. Very few are confident in expressing their opinion. 16% say I don't know anything enough about the cultural background to say anything. 8% are anxious about saying something wrong. No one says I don't have anything to say, which is pretty terrific. And then 30% are saying I will struggle, but I think it's important that we talk. Okay, so as I said, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm not trying to analyse that data. All I'm doing is saying this is how people are thinking in the room. So thank you very much for that. I think it's interesting. And here's the second poll. If prompted to talk about this paint, yes. So the second poll, if asked how this painting makes you feel, what best describes your response? So we're trying to tap a little bit more into emotions now. Thanks. Okay, I think the numbers have started drifting a bit. Well, this is interesting, isn't it? Most people are saying stimulated. The next is excited. And after that, connected, then enlightened. 2% feel neutral. No one feels alienated, and 2% feel somber. I think that's pretty fantastic. I think that's saying something about Mavis Ngallametta's art and connecting. So again, as I said, I'm not analysing the data. I just think it's terrific to get a sense of who's in the room and how you're thinking and how you're feeling. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so before we just did those polls, I sort of said, well, what do you do when you don't have any of those codes and you don't have Indigenous perspectives? How much you start talking about the art? And I like to think of it in terms of looking for cues, not codes. How is the artist trying to cross-culturally cue me here to looking in a certain way or thinking in a certain way? Mavis Ngallametta's art has lots of cues, particularly if you look at her art, instead of, just focusing on the individual artworks, if you look at her body of artwork and look at trends and, kind of recurring themes, etc., you start to see that we're being cued in all kinds of ways. You can see here in this Wooten as a Place, 2011, that she uses figurative elements which try to almost in a way literally identify something going on, people and place, etc. People fishing, anybody can get that from looking at the image. There's also this kind of drift. You can see a figure here under the dotting, a person standing up. There's a sort of a drift between figurative and, you know, whether or not it's intended as non-figurative, it certainly appears as a quite non-figurative elements. So she drifts between figurative and non-figurative. There's this micro and macro perspective. So we're really up close looking at, you know, details of, I don't know, that might even be a ladybug or something. So we're right up close. And then over here, we're almost like an aerial view of that, that beautiful country of all the waterways, etc. And you can see here in this little swamp on the way to Oban, you can see that we look like we're having this beautiful kind of aerial perspective of all of those waterways. And then there's these things that pop out as it's from the micro view, is kind of like, you know, burst out at us, like bursting out of a story, and then they're going to be, you know, drawn back in to that overall kind of flow of what the artwork is about. This is an example of what I'm trying to talk about there with this. It looks a little bit like an aerial map, like you're looking at contours and a sort of geo mapping, you know, where the freshwater streams all feed down into the coastline, and where there's clay pans, etc., and then going into the ocean or the Gulf there, etc. And then you see here these things that burst out at us. Sometimes they're birds, sometimes they're flowers, sometimes they're people, and they're not to scale. They don't seem to be, there's this sliding scale of time and space. We're not rooted in any particular perspective of time and space. We're shifting and moving through time and space as we look around the artwork. We can also look across Mavis Ngallametta's body of work, looking for cues in terms of the different types of work that she produces. If you can have a look at these sculptures here, and this is quite typical of sculpture from Aurukun. They're wonderful carvers in Aurukun, and have a long history of carving and creating three-dimensional forms from clay, etc., for ceremonial purposes and everyday purposes. But the thing that really stands out in their sculpture is their talent for characterization. And Mavis Ngallametta certainly has that. These, the figures look like they're ready to just, you know, rip into a story or identify themselves as part of some story, some narrative. There is a huge talent for characterization. And I think that Mavis Ngallametta brings that into her signature style. She characterizes country so that it's eloquent with a story and with a, you know, an idiosyncratic nature of this place at a certain time when certain people are there. It's kind of carrying all of that momentum with it as we go. Mavis Ngallametta is also a talented weaver, and I think it's interesting to think about how that weaving technique, you know, is about knitting things together, bringing all the elements together into a whole. And I think that part of the success of her her signature style is that interwoven nature of everything, making sure all the parts are pulled in together into that that one whole. Mavis Ngallametta also has a propensity for abstraction. This work here, white and yellow wattles in flower, you know, it's almost like an impressionist painting. It's about sensations, the sensation of white and yellow, and, you know, the sensations of how it sits across a landscape. It's not a figurative work at all. There's a propensity for almost an impressionist abstraction, if you like. And there's also a perspectivism, like shifting in time and scale. And this work here, the Pamp or Swamp artwork, when you look at it closely, you see that it's almost like the William Robinson Springbrook landscapes, where you look like you're looking at a landscape from the, you know, inside, and it's kind of, you know, coming out around you. But that doesn't make sense. It's you know, a completely imaginative perspective, if you like. The titles are other cues that were given in Mavis Ngallametta's art. You can see here, sometimes they're like places like the mouth of Kendall River, sometimes it's human activity, dragging net at Les Creek, etc. I think these are only cues because what's going on in all of them, even if we can't see the human figure that pops up as a kind of a cue, if you like, they're always there. It's always there notionally. So that shifting and changing between people and place in the titles is also the shifting and changing about what we're looking at when we look at this particular aesthetic. And again, particularly, I think I just love the way that these things kind of pop out, like they're pushing a part of a story for a little while, and that part of the story will drop back in to this overall, you know, fluidity of what's going on. Mavis Ngallametta also, I think, as I said before, characterises country. She creates drama, a story, a mood, something's going on. It's almost like theatre on canvas, and you get sucked into it. You get sucked into the spectatorship. This one here, bushfire at Kuchendupen. That's completely wrong, but we'll run with that. And I'll particularly want to draw your attention in this artwork to the way that blue underpainting that takes the brown and white and red ochres, sometimes yellow ochres, sometimes black, charcoal, etc. The way that it helps that pop, that vitality, that intensity. She's a very sophisticated artist in her use of colour, in her understanding of how, you know, colour in itself creates a story and speaks and is eloquent, and has this kind of, you know, dramatic flavour to it. And here, you know, it's almost like we can how this bushfire is building in the centre here and becomes this bushfire front as it's raged through the country and making its way to the coastline. And it's subtly done. It's not figurative. It's from an understanding of what it feels like to be there when the bushfire season is happening. Now, I just want to turn briefly to this concept of emotional ecology. We've had a bit of a look at Mavis Ngallametta's art, but I just want to think about the concept a little bit more. There's a growing volume of academic publications on emotional ecology, including journals such as Emotion, Space and Society, that focus on emotional intersections between people and place. So that's your sort of simple definition, if you like, for emotional ecology. Now, when I was first going to present this before it was cancelled under COVID, this lecture, I was going to speak about these academic approaches, if you like, or this published literature to emotional ecology a little more. However, on Monday of this week, I was listening to Nadi Simpson being interviewed by Richard Feidler on an ABC podcast in the Conversation series. And because I had this exhibition in mind and Mavis Ngallametta's work, and I'd been reading that emotional ecology material, when I was listening to that podcast, I realised that I had just heard a far more eloquent expression of emotional ecology than I'd read in the academic literature. And of course, this is because it was from an Indigenous person who was speaking about, wasn't calling it emotional ecology, but was certainly speaking about an emotional ecology in her interview. So Nadi Simpson is Yawalarroy's songwriter, performer and member of the musical group I'm sure you've all heard of called the Stiff Gins, who've been around for quite some time. Nadi grew up in Sydney, but her traditional homelands is in the northwest New South Wales area of Narran Lakes. So what you're looking at there is an aerial photograph and a kind of map, if you like, showing you where the Narran Lakes are. So obviously a long way from Arakoon, but with remarkable similarities, particularly when you listen to the way Nadi speaks about it. It's an area that includes a network of rivers, floodplains and seasonal wetlands, quite similar in its character, the ebb and flow of water, etc., to Mavis Ngallametta's country. But it was what Nadi said about her country and how it informs her creative expression that really resonated with me about the visual cues in Mavis Ngallametta's work. In her songwriting, Nadi says that she's drawn to ancient stories of her homeland through Butler, and that's the Yawalarroy's term for the dreaming, if you like. Nadi says, and I quote, "It is a cycle of being and how I interact with time when I talk about culture." That's the end of the quote. As I just mentioned, there is I see a sliding scale of time and space in Mavis Ngallametta's art that I think relates to Nadi's comment here about interacting with time when expressing culture. It just happens. When you start yarning culture, it just happens, this sliding scale of time and space. Nadi also speaks about multiplicity, or the simultaneous multiple meanings embedded in language. She speaks of the word winingala, which means in Yawalarroy to talk, to listen, to know, and to dream. So when you use this word, it means all of those things at once, which is cognitively and emotionally very different to articulating more singular meaning that we have more in a, let's say, a Western habit of cultural translation or interpretation at the very least, or even in terms of, you know, a Western sense of communication, this idea of articulation, when you have this complexity of all of these different meanings working at once. I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind when we're looking at the, I would argue, a multiplicity and a simultaneity in this emotional ecology that we have in visual form in Mavis Ngallametta's work. Nadi Simpson spoke of how emotions are cued by country in her ancestral stories. She spoke of how the wetland relates to the sky. The sky is a watercourse, Warrumbul, where water spills from the sky over the land, and the sky in turn is reflected on the surface of the water. Nadi spoke of how the night sky stories tell of twinkling stars being the sky's laughter with joy, laughing at the people on country or with them. And the sky also has sadness in mourning stories where the deceased body transitions from the ground to the sky to travel back home to country. This is the cycle of being that Nadi mentioned earlier, encompassing and synthesizing country and culture. To me, this joy of life is popping out. There's, you know, there's this idea of reflections and a sparkle of life in Mavis Ngallametta's paintings. Nadi spoke of how this connection to country inspires her in what she calls transformational performances that connect her with audiences in her music. It made me think about Mavis Ngallametta's paintings as transformational performances that connect with audiences. even if the emotion that they conjure or the idea that they conjure is sometimes somewhat overwhelming. You know, where are we? Where do we start with this complex imagery that we're looking at here? I think there is a strong current of potent fluidity that keeps connecting and building cognitively and emotionally in Mavis Ngallametta's work, similarly to the way Nadi Simpson is talking about her music and how it connects with all kinds of audiences around the country. Mavis Ngallametta's paintings have passages of intensity that ebb and flow, ooze and trickle in a very emotional way. I think they have a musical quality. I think that they dance and that they sing and that they have that whole kind of cultural cohesion, and they do those things with country. Nadi's most eloquent expression of emotional ecology came for me when Richard Feidler asked her how she tried to capture landscape in her music. Nadi replied. Now I'm going to read a quote from her interview here, but I'd just like you to keep looking at this artwork and as you hear Nadi's voices and talking about how she captures landscape in her music. I begin the quote. It's really a love letter to that place. And if that's played or I sing it, then I can be there. I can actually travel there in my mind's eye. So that creative endeavor shrinks distance and enables me to get there. I think about what I see when I am there and what I bring back. And I think about the trouble and the difficulties that the natural environment has in trying to vie for survival in a really heavily cultivated time, or when it was so sorrowful and I haven't been able to write that thing, how I felt about it, but I can write the memory of what it looks like. So there are levels and layers that you get into, how you relate to the health of the land. But when I think about that dry riverbed during drought, that was really sad. But now the water is back, the birds are coming back, and this is a beautiful thing. Such a devastating loss of a dry riverbed, yet water comes back. Warrumble rises again. The land can sing in a different way. I think about how there is a cycle and how resilient is that place, no matter what we throw at it. It can still sing, and that shows how powerful landscape is, no matter where you are. The stars can be seen in the water again and laughing at people above and below you. And the emu is there. You are never alone. That is a beautiful thing. As I said, I don't want to say any more here because I'm asking you to, I'm using Nadi's words to talk about this artwork. To me, it resonates so much with what I'm seeing. And her words are working better than mine. In some of these images now, I've just put up words that I just think, you know, I sort of tried to do a kind of word cloud, if you like, myself about what, you know, if you had to put a word here, not coming from an Indigenous culture, if you do believe there's an emotional ecology there, what kind of a word can you put with this? You know, the word pulsing, you know, there's a life force. You can feel it. Picking up on what Nadi said about a transformational performance, this idea of shifting, this idea of having an understanding of the transformational nature of place and its character, its seasonal moods, if you like, but also a kind of transformational impact on how we think about it and how we feel about it and the shifts and changes in us that, you know, maybe try to get in sync with that or try to work with it or understand it. This work of Mavis Ngallametta's very much speaks to me, probably because the blue is more, the blue background's coming through more, and there's obviously more of the ocean, the Gulf and the coastline, etc. But I feel the celestial nature. This artwork is an interesting one in terms of starting to paint at Kendall River. Mavis Ngallametta's visited Kendall River after many years. This is one of her particular homelands, and she visited Kendall River after many, quite some time, decades. And, you know, she's talked about how before that, she was painting these places from memory, which is really interesting. And exactly what Nadi was talking about, you know, trying to tap into memory to paint make the connectedness with country and with culture. And this is when, this is Mavis Ngallametta after she comes back actually to this place and starts painting there. So it's quite an important moment in the whole story of what she's doing. Does it change her artwork? I don't know. I mean, it's probably the topic for another another talk, maybe by someone else, but it's an interesting thing that painting from memory and then painting after being there is an interesting aspect. But this work particularly just registers with me of Nadi Simpson's story about Warrambul, you know, the waters spilling over into the sky, the water course in the sky spilling over and coming down onto country, and then the reflections going back up. I feel like I can feel that synergy between the wetland and the sky, and there is something, you know, sparkling about the artwork, the reflections of the night sky maybe. Nadi Simpson mentioned the multiplicity of meaning, those simultaneous meanings of language that sit one next to one another. This is one of the artworks, and this is Ecology. So this is that striped cliff that I showed earlier that have the red and white ochres that Mavis was getting the ochres from earlier. This is a slightly unusual artwork. It's an earlier one, 2011, in this idiom, and you can see here that it almost feels like she's working with a particular symbology, but to me it shows the complexity of what's going on in this aesthetic, all the different elements and aspects, and each in themselves telling stories and connecting and shifting and moving about, but in that beautiful way where to think, to know, to feel, to dream, all at once, coming together, working together. It's very sophisticated intellectually and emotionally when you really kind of drill in down into what's going on here. How do I tap into this? I think there's an intricate connectivity. This is that potent fluidity. Mavis Ngallametta controls the pictorial space. She controls the composition. It's surging and bursting with energy. It's moving the eye around, but there's a connectivity that holds it all firm and gives it its power. And this is an example. It's the transformation. This is collecting ghost nets at Big Horse Creek, but here again there's these figurative elements that kind of pop out of something that is quite a macro view, a micro view, if you like. But to me this looks like these things here, this scene, this activity erupts, and then it'll go back into the story, an overall story. There's the landscape and the human activity are interacting, and it's transforming as we go. And I think it transforms as we look and go through the image. Things come in and come out of focus. And change in scale, in time and space, etc. So this is, I'm talking about disorientation and immersion. We think about her work in terms of, and I think Nadi was speaking about immersion. Sometimes we think we know where we are, and then we move up and we're disorientated. We're not on the coastline. Where are we? We're immersed in something. And I think this is important for non-Indigenous people, is that I think one of the reasons that we're so connected, and you said you felt connected, excited, stimulated by our artwork, is that whatever you know about this work or not, there is a sense that we're inside what's going on because there's simply no way to be outside, you know? And this is going to be, this is a kind of contradiction to what I'm about to say in a minute to close, but this is something I think is that there's just something away about her transformative performance, that potent fluidity pulls us in. So whatever we may not understand entirely what we're inside, but we're inside and not outside. And I think from a cross-cultural conditioning, that's pure magic that she can do that she can do that with paint. Now, I'm just going to mention very briefly at the end here, talk about immersion versus exposure. And really what I mean by that is that it was something I found in the tension between the way that I sense emotional ecology and Mavis Ngallametta's work and what Nadi Simpson was saying, and the way that the academic literature was talking about emotional ecology. And I'll just quote a few things here for a moment. And I just want you to think about an artist, Ian Fairweather, for instance, who I think does try to bring in the human and natural ecology together. This is Pumicestone Passage from 1957. You see Glasshouse Mountains, etc. But he's got that shifting time and scale and space. And, you know, quite often we get the, you know, characterization of human activity that Mavis Ngallametta evokes, and trying to bring that together, bus stop into time and space, etc. Gethsemane, agony in the garden. Do we feel that emotion, agony? I'm not sure. And this kite flying. And bear in mind, I'm a huge fan of Ian Fairweather's work, but I'm trying to tease out a difference here in emotional ecology. So this quickly is some of the quotes from some of the academic literature describing emotional ecology, talking about an effective entanglement with ecology, or the difficulties in recognizing and owning up to having such feelings, not to mention trying to give an account to others, or emotions arising through our exposure to the world and that expose us to the world's patternings and its vagaries. So what I'm trying to get at there is there's this sort of, I think Alexis Wright, in that wonderful book that evokes impact of climate change, the Swan book, she talks about it as the plague of outsidedness, you know? And to me, there's a sense that there's an outsidedness in a, you know, certainly a Western, if you like, understanding of that emotional ecology. I almost feel as though exactly what they were saying is, we can't really speak about love culturally in terms of that ecology. We struggle for that. To call it a love letter is I think quite difficult. And I'd even include that where I think Fred Williams, for instance, he tries to get on the inside of that emotional ecology of connectedness of people and place, etc. But I still think that we've got a lot to learn there about getting over that, learning from Indigenous cultures about expressing and understanding that that emotion. And I think particularly, I think it's so important for where we're at with climate change. You know, we've got a lot to learn from Indigenous people about owning that love and acting on it and making it part of who we are. And I think it very much, to me, is evocative in Mavis Ngallametta aesthetic, and certainly in Nadi Simpson's theory of emotional ecology that she espoused in her interview. That's it. I think I've actually kept on time, which is extraordinary for me. So thank you, everyone.